very warm welcome. You're watching One India English with me, Anupati Kaur, and this is our special show, Global Chit-Chat. As we know that we are reeling under the coronavirus pandemic for more than a year, and the situation is really bad even now. We've seen that how the international travel has been affected, and the international tourism industry has been badly hit. But what is the way ahead? We're joined by our foreign policy expert, Mr. Tirthavesh Singh Meni. Thanks a lot for joining us, sir. So, sir, as we see that we are still reeling under the coronavirus pandemic, things are not getting better. And the international travel is a major concern. We had been waiting for the international travel to resume like it was earlier, but it remains difficult given that there are new strains of viruses that are spreading across countries, across the world. So, what is going to be the future of international travel? Do you think that at this point of time, countries can come up with some innovative strategies to resume the travel?
So first of all, even in the midst of the pandemic, as far as travel pertaining to essential purposes was concerned, like for instance for education, for family, in certain cases when people had emergencies and that to go back to the respective countries, or if one looks at in the context of India, for instance, if you look at the Gulf, if people were stranded somewhere, so there were arrangements for them. So you had some what is called air bubbles in place, So wherever there's for instance, in the case of India, wherever there's a large Indian diaspora, as I said, be one in the West, if you look at the case of the West, in the US, in UK, and then of course, as I said, a lot of the workers, mostly from Kerala, but from other parts of India as well, who were stranded in the Gulf. So arrangements were made for them. Now as things began to improve in the summer, towards the end of the summer, and then if one comes to the beginning of the winter, there were a few countries which also opened up. Now, what one needs to look at is that this is all dependent upon one, each country has reacted differently. So obviously, some countries who handled the pandemic well and who have kept the cases low, they have been very cautious. Case in point, I mean, one is obviously if you look at the instance of Singapore, and then if you look at a case like New Zealand, so they have been very cautious. There are other countries which have opened up, they imposed restrictions, but they also realize that at the end of the day, you need to, I mean, if you have, as far as students are concerned or businesses are concerned, they were willing to keep at least the bare minimum connectivity which is required. So as I said, every country has reacted very differently to it. And then a lot is also based upon, the relations. So for instance, if you look at Southeast Asia, Singapore, for instance, began to open up. But, there were various levels. You had bubbles, you had a green channel. So, and again, there are different approaches. So one is where you don't need any much lesser quarantine. In other cases, you do not need quarantine. But then there were restrictions of some kind in place. So as I said, countries have been putting their heads together. You've also had some multilateral organizations, some regional organizations working, for creating bubbles amongst themselves. But this is rather complicated. I mean, so for instance, it's not based. No country has really framed this sort of, these bubbles or some sort of opening up on the basis of geographical contiguity. It's on the basis of, obviously, one is safety, how other countries, they probably look at how other countries have handled the pandemic, or the other thing is economic priorities. So efforts have been made, but it's very tough, to come up with any one sort of solution.
So at this point of time, we see that countries are looking at different options, how to open up travel. Of course, the bubble travel is there, but there's a new concept of vaccine passport which has come up. Israel has introduced it, but it has been opposed by a lot of countries. Do you think that a vaccine passport is really a feasible solution at this point of time?
If one were to look at the concept of a vaccine passport, now theoretically it seems very good, in terms of safety, that you've had your vaccination, you've tested negative, or you have immunity, you have antibodies and all that, right? Now, there are a few things which need to be borne in mind. The first is that, if you look at it in the Western narrative or from a Western standpoint, they are very particular about privacy, personal freedoms. So naturally, I mean, interestingly, both in the UK and in the US, the opposition parties have, been vehement in their criticism and their opposition to such an idea. And I may also want to add, so in the UK, you have a left of centre party which is opposing this, that's the Labour Party. And of course, even the Scottish National Party is also opposed it. And if you look at the US, obviously you have a left of centre dispensation, the Democrats are ruling, and the right of centre Republicans. I mean, Republicans, of course, are not right of centre. Many people argue they're way more right, but they are also. So in both contexts, people are talking about personal freedoms, that this will impinge upon personal freedoms, liberties, and you can track information and all. So that is the debate for the first world, for the developed world. The other thing which you need to bear in mind is that we also have a lot of, for instance, African countries are saying, that developing countries are facing what is called vaccine apartheid. So if you actually look at the figures and if you see the developed world, they have actually got more than 50% of the total number of global vaccines. I think around 60% or something. So if you add up the developing world, what the developing countries are saying is that if you have a vaccine passport in place, automatically it is discriminatory because obviously the rate of vaccination is much slower. And then you have another alternative also, which IATA has come up with, that you have a sort of digital pass. I think Singapore is the first country, probably in the first week of May, they're going to be looking at this arrangement, similar to the vaccine passport, that basically, on one document which shows that you've got tested, you've got the vaccine. Now, but again, the issue is that how many, obviously there are some specified sort of vaccine centers where you need to be vaccinated. So how are they going to work that out? Is there going to be any difference in the approach again, towards the developed world and developing countries? Are you going to have a restricted number of centers which you're going to look at? That's one part. And also, even as far as testing is concerned, at times you have cases where people test negative and they reach somewhere, in another country when you get the testing done after 2-3 days. You may test positive. So these issues are there. But what I'm trying to say is basically there are major issues with the vaccine passport for different reasons. I mean, people are critical of it for different reasons. But I think you need to find a middle ground, because obviously you will need an arrangement where you need to reduce the quarantine period. You need to make travel not just less cumbersome, but also it should less expensive, because obviously a lot, if you look at the time period, so you need to strike a balance.
Also, if you look at, of course, there is a lot of dilemma when it comes to vaccination as well. There have been a lot of people who have had both the doses of vaccinations here in India and they've tested positive even after that. So that will lead to a lot of questions on the credibility of that vaccine passport as well. So talking about at this point of time, we see that the countries are experiencing different waves of the coronavirus. We've seen that India almost had reached 9,000 cases per day, and now we see we are in the even a bigger crisis than we had last time. So at this point of time, do you think it's really possible for countries to decide how to strategize their international travel, like how to resume? Because at one point you see the cases are rising, and on the other hand you see cases are falling. So do you think there can be a strategy in place?
I think it's going to be very tough for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously there are countries who've handled the pandemic really well, but they also depend upon tourism. Now, prolonging this is impacting their economies. So you can keep yourself safe, but you're also, your domestic economy is getting hit. So that is one problem. That's a serious problem. What I would like to say is that the bigger challenge is that, I mean, at some point of time, the real challenge is going to be even as far as the testing part is concerned. That when you test negative, test positive, will every country, for instance, say that, okay, the testing done in India with a developed country, say that okay, the testing done in India is fine, you need to come here again, because then you're following essentially the same. Because even right now you can travel if you actually quarantine in 14, 15 days, get a test done, pay all that money, you can travel to a lot of countries. How do you move to the next step where either you you reduce the quarantine time, or so for instance, either there should be no requirement that before traveling from India that you get the testing done. When it's double that you're getting it done over here, you're getting it done over there, that's problematic. So I think
Mm.
ways and means will have to be found out. But at this point of time, the primary challenge is for a number of countries dealing with the pandemic. And you very rightly point, as far as there is obviously a lot of people believe that once you have the vaccine, you're safe. Now, following precautions after the vaccine is equally important, if not more important. Masking up, social distancing, and all that. Because even in America, in spite of the vaccination, you are seeing that cases are rising in certain places.
Yeah.
India, in a number of states, they've risen. And then also, the other challenge at this point of time is that not just we are back to that situation where not only will you need to calibrate international travel, you will also need to come up with calibrated restrictions
Yeah.
domestic. So I think tough times, but I think obviously it needs a very multiple stakeholders, not just domestically in
Yeah.
countries, but internationally. We need to work together, be sensitive to each other, while obviously looking at their own interests as well. That's
Okay, thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for joining us. And all
thank you.
those watching us, I
Thank
hope
you.
you've learned something from this discussion. And of course, we are all waiting for the international travel to resume. We've kept all our plans on hold, but this is a time to be safe and stay at home and wait for the pandemic to be over, because things will get over. So we have to stay patient. Keep watching One India English.